Hello again. We're back, and now we're going to talk about the National Correct Coding Initiative. And again, the National Correct Coding Initiative goes back to the end of 1989, and it was intended to reduce the deficit by creating new laws, regulations that cut federal spending, particularly federal spending that was inappropriate involving Medicare. And this section of this replaced the previous reasonable charge mechanism with actual customary and prevailing charges, moving to the resource-based relative value unit scale. And so this started it back in 1992 and was implemented, and we're still dealing with the effects of it today. What CMS allowed the NCCI to do was to put an emphasis on coding correctly, limit improper coding, and support appropriate payment. It really based things on the CPT book, of course, CPT published by the AMA. It had addressed national and local Medicare policies and edits, talked about standard medical and surgical practices, which we'll get into, and current coding practice. The purpose was primarily to prevent physicians from reporting two procedures together when there was a third separate code that describes things being combinations. So this is one of the main focuses of this, is to eliminate people parsing things out and getting additional reimbursement, as we'll see. It requires physicians and other providers as well to report the complete procedure code instead of using these multiple codes that describe parts of a procedure. So if there's prep work involved, shaving, things like that, that is, if it's part of the complete procedure, you just report the complete procedure code. You don't parse out every step of it. Also requires physicians and providers to report only the more extensive version of the procedure performed and disallow reporting both extensive and limited procedures. So in other words, if you do a diagnostic and a curative procedure, it's understood that you're doing the diagnostic as a way to get to that procedure. It's not allowing you to go and code for both. This is kind of loosely referred to as unbundling. So sometimes unbundling is unintentional. So basically, a lot of people in the medical offices don't have complete command of every aspect of CPT. So they unintentionally report two procedures when there's one correct procedure to report. Some examples: fragmenting one service into each component part, reporting separate codes for any related services when there's one code. When there's a code for bilateral procedure, one bilateral code, people report two separate codes for a left and a right. Downcoding services so they can use an additional code, and separating a surgical access from a major surgical service. And we'll get more into that when we get into the surgical and global period section. NCCI edits were developed, again, for these types of correct coding. And since we have new codes coming out all the time, they're updated annually with edits being published every quarter. Any change to the NCCI edits are determined by three sources. And this includes modifications to the CPT codes, HCPCS, and the code book instructions. They solicit comments from the AMA, national and local and medical surgical societies, Medicare contractors, staff, provider, and billing consultants. Unfortunately, I can't show you this section because I don't have the textbook in an electronic format where it really is well explained. But if you go to your text and look at where they have the modifier indicator and focus on these 3 bullet points. If there's an indicator of 1, it's saying that a modifier may be used to bypass the edit for that code pair. If it has a 0, it means the modifier cannot be used to pass that edit. And if it has a 9, it means that this edit was retroactively deleted and it's no longer in use. And again, we have some anatomical modifiers, the E1 through E4, F1 through F9, and so on, right, left. And then, of course, the modifier 25 for the separate distinct services. And again, important to understand the purpose of each modifier. One that's targeted for special audits is misusing modifier 59. So this is related to claiming a different procedure or surgery. And under these edits, the code descriptors of the 2 codes of a code pair consisting of 2 distinct procedures usually are different. And the edits showing that these 2 cannot be reported together if it's reported at the same site and the same patient encounter. And we'll take a look at some of those when we get into the surgical section. And more examples of this. Things if we have a service that's integral to a large number of procedures, these include such things as cleaning, shaving, prepping the skin for surgery, draping and positioning the patient, inserting IVs for medications, sedative administration, topical anesthesia, approaches, all these different types of things. The purpose is we can't parse these out and submit them for billing. And again, more examples, surgical cultures, wound irrigation, removing drains, all these other different types of things. And lastly, we have some edits that are called medically unlikely edits, or MUEs. And again, this is the maximum number of units of service that are allowed by the same provider on the same beneficiary on the same data service. Anything that goes above and beyond that, CMS doesn't pay for. And these MUEs do not exist for every single CPT code. And there's no way to bypass these. And that's all I have for you. Please stop by if you have any other questions or something that you need. Please see me during office hours. Thank you so much, and we'll see you online.